My sister whispered through the phone, "Diane, if I don't sign those papers this week, they say I won't be living in this house anymore." But what they didn't know was that the woman they thought they could control was about to disappear, and someone else was about to take her place. Before we begin, if you enjoy powerful stories about courage, family, and women standing up for themselves, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps more people hear stories like this. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Diane Callahan. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life I worked as a crisis negotiator. For nearly 3 decades, I sat across tables from people who were angry, desperate, manipulative, and sometimes dangerous. My job was to stay calm when everyone else was losing control. And over the years, I learned something very important. People reveal the truth when they believe you're powerless. That lesson saved hundreds of lives during my career. But the most important time I ever used it wasn't in a police building or negotiation room. It happened inside my own family. More specifically, it started with a phone call from my twin sister. My sister's name is Elaine Foster. She's my identical twin. Same face, same voice, same gray hair that started appearing in our 40s. But if you met us today, you would think we were completely different people. I became strong and sharp from years of high-pressure negotiations. Elaine remained soft and trusting, the way she always was growing up. When we were young girls, Elaine was the one who believed everyone meant well. I was the one who checked the details. She married early. I built a career. She stayed in our hometown for most of her life with her husband, Harold Foster, my brother-in-law. Harold is 71 now, and if there's one thing you should know about Harold, it's this. He believes control equals respect. He believes whoever controls the money controls the family. For years, I suspected he treated Elaine poorly. But every time I asked her, she would smile and say the same thing. "Everything is fine, Diane," and for a long time I believed her, until one night everything changed. It was a Thursday evening. I was sitting in my small lake house reading a book when my phone rang. When I saw Elaine's name on the screen, I smiled. We usually talked every few weeks. But the moment I answered, something felt wrong. Her voice was shaking. "Diane, are you alone?" The way she whispered those words immediately put my instincts on alert. I had spent years listening to voices under pressure. Fear has a very specific sound. "Yes," I said calmly. "What's going on?" There was a long pause, then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "They want me to sign papers this Saturday." "Who is they?" I asked. Another pause. "Harold and Mark." Mark Foster is Harold's son from a previous relationship. He's 39 years old and has always been ambitious in the worst possible way. The kind of man who sees opportunity in other people's weakness. And Mark's wife Rachel, she's charming when people are watching, but behind closed doors she's just as calculating as her husband. "Sign what papers?" I asked. Elaine's voice dropped lower. "They say the land needs to be transferred into the family company." Now that sentence may sound innocent, but something about the way she said it told me there was more. "What land?" I asked carefully. "The back property. The one Mom left me?" Now my mind started moving quickly. Our mother had owned a large piece of rural land outside town. Years ago, when she passed away, she left that land to Elaine. At the time, it didn't seem worth much. But recently, I had heard rumors that developers were buying property in that area. "Why do they want it transferred?" I asked. "They say it's for taxes," Elaine whispered. When someone says they say, it usually means they don't fully understand what they're being told. That's when she said something else that made the room go quiet. "They told me if I don't sign, they'll make other arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. She hesitated, then she said something I will never forget. "Harold said maybe I'm getting too forgetful to manage things anymore." Now let me translate that for you. In many legal situations, if someone can convince a court that a person is mentally incapable of managing property, they can take control of it. I had seen this strategy before, and suddenly the entire situation became clear. "Elaine," I said slowly, "has Harold been talking about doctors lately?" "Yes," she whispered, my jaw tightened. "And Mark, he keeps talking about developers buying land nearby. Diane, he says this property could be worth a lot someday." Now we were getting closer to the truth. Greed leaves patterns, but the most painful part of that conversation came next. Elaine said something very quietly. I don't think they want me in the house anymore. For a moment, I didn't speak. Because in that moment, the negotiator inside me wasn't thinking. The sister inside me was. You mean your own home? I asked. Yes, her voice cracked slightly. They say it would be easier if I moved somewhere smaller. Moved somewhere smaller, in other words, removed. I took a slow breath. Elaine, I said gently, I need you to answer something honestly. Are you afraid of them? There was a silence that lasted nearly 10 seconds, and then she whispered one word. Yes. That was the moment I made my decision, but I didn't tell her yet. Instead, I asked her something else. When are these papers supposed to be signed? Saturday afternoon. Mark invited some business friends over to celebrate. Celebrate, interesting choice of word, because celebrations usually mean witnesses. And witnesses can be very useful. Elaine, I said carefully, what if you didn't sign anything on Saturday? They won't accept that. What if you didn't have to be there? She sounded confused. What do you mean? That's when I looked at my reflection in the dark window beside me and saw my sister's face looking back. Identical. We had used that resemblance as children to confuse teachers and switch seats during exams. But suddenly, that old childhood trick didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a strategy. What if, I said slowly, someone else attended the meeting for you? Diane, I don't understand. I smiled slightly. Because I understood perfectly. You and I look exactly alike, I said, and some people only see what they expect to see. She was silent again. You're not saying yes, I said. I am. Another long pause. Diane, that's crazy. No, I replied calmly. It's careful. Because if I had learned one thing during 30 years of negotiations, it was this. Sometimes the most powerful move is letting the other side believe they're winning, while you quietly collect the truth. But what Elaine didn't know yet was that the real story about that land was far bigger than Harold and Mark had told her. In the moment they realized who was actually sitting at that table on Saturday, everything in their lives was about to change. When I told my twin sister Elaine that I was going to take her place at that meeting, she thought I had lost my mind. She kept repeating the same sentence over and over. Diane, this is too dangerous. But the truth is, people often confuse danger with exposure. Danger is when someone knows exactly who they're dealing with. Exposure is when they don't. And right now, Harold, Mark, and Rachel believed they were dealing with a quiet woman who had spent years apologizing for existing. They had no idea who was actually about to walk into that house. Listen to me carefully, I told Elaine over the phone. You are not going back there tonight. Where would I go? She asked. To a hotel. Diane, I can't afford that, I smiled. Lucky for you, your sister spent 30 years negotiating with people who make very expensive mistakes. She let out a small, nervous laugh, but I could still hear the fear in her breathing, so I softened my voice. Elaine, I need you to trust me. Of course I trust you. Then here's what we're going to do. For the next 20 minutes, I explained the plan. It wasn't reckless, it was precise. First, Elaine would quietly leave the house the next morning while Harold and Mark were out. She would take only the essentials. Then she would drive to a small hotel 2 towns away where I would meet her later that evening. Until Saturday, she would disappear completely. No phone calls, no contact, no explanations. Meanwhile, I would walk into her house and become Elaine Foster. I could hear her breathing again through the phone. But Diane, Harold knows me? Yes, I said calmly. But Harold knows the version of you he created. And that was the real problem. When people manipulate someone for years, they stop seeing the person. They only see the role. Harold believed Elaine was timid. Mark believed she was confused. Rachel believed she could be pressured. And if I played that role carefully, they would show me exactly what they were planning. Diane, Elaine whispered. What if they realize it's you? They won't. How can you be so sure? Because I had seen this pattern my entire career. People rarely question what benefits them. If Harold believed Elaine was finally ready to sign those papers, he wouldn't look closely. Greed makes people careless, but there was one more thing I needed before this plan began: evidence. Elaine, I said, I need you to tell me everything about the land. What do you mean, the property Mom left you? Well, it's just farmland. Just farmland, yes. About 15 acres behind the house. 15 acres. I leaned back in my chair. Has anyone offered to buy it recently? There was a pause. Actually, yes. Now we were getting somewhere. Who? Mark mentioned that some development company had asked about it. Did he say how much they offered? No. Did he say why they wanted it? Something about expanding the highway nearby. That confirmed my suspicion. Land near expanding highways often increases in value very quickly. And if Mark was pushing so hard to take ownership, it meant the land was worth far more than Elaine realized. Which meant I needed someone who could verify it. Someone who understood property law better than anyone I knew. So after I hung up with Elaine, I made another call. Victor, I said when the line picked up. Victor Lang is an old friend of mine. He's 70 now, a retired property attorney who spent 40 years dealing with land disputes, development contracts, and complicated legal traps. If someone was trying to steal that land, Victor would see it immediately. Well, Diane, Victor chuckled, it's been a while. What kind of trouble are you calling about tonight? The complicated kind. That got his attention. I explained the situation carefully, every detail, the pressure, the papers, the sudden urgency, and when I finished, Victor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said something interesting. Diane, that land might be extremely valuable. How valuable? I can't say without checking records. But if developers are involved, it could easily be worth millions. Millions. Now the entire situation made sense. Harold wasn't trying to simplify finances. He was trying to control a fortune. When can you check? I asked. I'll start first thing tomorrow. Good. Why the rush? Because Saturday afternoon they expect Elaine to sign everything away. Victor exhaled slowly. And what exactly are you planning to do about that? I looked out at the dark water outside my window. Attend the meeting. As Elaine, yes, Victor laughed softly. You always did like unusual strategies. Will you help? Of course I will. Then his tone became serious. But Diane, be careful. Always. We hung up, but before the night ended, I received another piece of information. It came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Mrs. Gloria Jenkins. Gloria lives next door to Elaine's house. She's 74, retired, and the kind of neighbor who notices everything even when she pretends not to. Elaine had mentioned her during our call, so I decided to check something. When Gloria answered, she sounded pleasantly surprised. Diane, my goodness, I haven't heard your voice in years. Hello, Gloria. After a few minutes of catching up, I asked the question that mattered. How have things been next door? There was a pause, then she sighed. Well, if I'm being honest, not good. Why do you say that? Your sister doesn't seem like herself anymore. What do you mean? I see her less and less. And when I do, she looks tired. Then Gloria lowered her voice. And that son of Harold's, Mark? Yes, he's always bringing people to the house. What kind of people? Men in expensive suits. That confirmed everything. Developers, investors, people who knew exactly what that land was worth. And suddenly I understood something else. They weren't just planning to pressure Elaine. They were planning to rush her, make her sign before she had time to ask questions, before she had time to realize the truth, before someone like me showed up. But now that timeline had changed. Because in 48 hours, when Harold called Elaine to sit at that table, he wouldn't be speaking to the woman he thought he controlled. He would be speaking to me. And what Harold Foster didn't understand yet was that I had spent 3 decades studying people exactly like him. But the most dangerous part of the plan was something I still hadn't told Elaine. Because the moment I stepped inside that house pretending to be her, I would be living under the same roof as the people who had been quietly planning to take everything from her. And sometimes, when greedy people believe they are finally winning, they reveal far more than they should. The morning my sister Elaine left her house was the moment our plan truly began. And what happened that day taught me something I want every woman listening to remember. Sometimes the strongest decision you can make is simply walking away from a place that no longer respects you. At exactly 9:15 that Friday morning, my phone rang. Elaine's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. I'm in the car, she whispered. Good, I said calmly. Are you already on the road? Yes. Her voice was trembling slightly. I could hear the engine running and the faint sound of gravel under her tires as she pulled away from the driveway. Did anyone see you leave? I asked. I don't think so. Did you take only what we discussed? Yes, just my purse, my documents, and a small bag. Perfect. Where are you heading now? I asked. To the hotel you told me about. Good, don't stop anywhere else and don't answer any phone calls from the house. There was a small pause. Diane, yes, what if Harold notices I'm gone? He will, I said calmly. But by the time he realizes it, I'll already be there. That sentence finally made her quiet, because the reality of what we were about to do was sinking in. For the next 2 hours, I drove toward the small town where Elaine had lived for most of her life. The road passed through farmland and quiet neighborhoods that hadn't changed much in 30 years. But my mind was working through every possible scenario. That's something my career trained me to do. When you negotiate high-risk situations for decades, you learn to study people before you ever meet them. And in this situation, the people I needed to understand were very clear. First, there was my brother-in-law, Harold Foster. Harold was 71, but he still carried himself like a man who believed the world should move according to his instructions. For years, he had controlled the finances in that house, controlled the decisions, controlled the narrative. But control is a fragile thing. It only works when the other person believes they have no options. Then there was Mark Foster, Harold's son. Mark was 39, ambitious and impatient. Unlike Harold, who preferred slow manipulation, Mark believed in pressure. Push someone hard enough and eventually they break. And finally, there was Mark's wife, Rachel. Rachel Foster was the most interesting of the three. People like Rachel rarely raise their voices. They smile, they speak gently, but behind that calm exterior, they move conversations in exactly the direction they want. Between the three of them, Elaine had been surrounded for years. And slowly, piece by piece, they had convinced her she was powerless. But they had made one critical mistake. They assumed Elaine had no one else paying attention. By the time I arrived at the hotel, Elaine was already sitting in the lobby. When she saw me walk through the door, she stood up quickly. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Even at 67, the resemblance was still remarkable. Same height, same face, same silver hair. If strangers saw us from across the room, they wouldn't know the difference. But standing close to her, I noticed something else. Elaine looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, emotionally. Years of walking carefully around Harold's moods had taken something from her. She walked toward me slowly. I still can't believe we're doing this, she said. I smiled gently. You used to switch places with me during school exams, I reminded her. That was different. Yes, I said, this time the stakes are higher. We sat down at a quiet table in the corner. For the next hour, we went through every detail. How does Harold usually speak to you? I asked. She hesitated. He gives instructions more than he asks questions. Good to know. And Mark? I asked. He's more aggressive. And Rachel? Elaine sighed. Rachel pretends she's helping. Of course she does. Manipulators often hide behind kindness. Then I asked something important. What happens during dinner conversations? Elaine thought carefully. Harold usually talks about money or complains about expenses. And if you disagree with him? She gave a small, sad smile. I usually don't. I leaned forward slightly. That changes now. She looked surprised. But Diane, won't that make them suspicious? Not if you do it carefully. Because negotiation isn't about confrontation. It's about subtle shifts. You introduce just enough resistance to see how the other side reacts. That reaction tells you everything. Finally, we reached the part of the plan that mattered most, the meeting on Saturday. Mark invited several people, Elaine explained. Business partners, maybe developers. Good, I said. Why good? Because witnesses make people behave differently. But there was still one missing piece of information, and right on time, my phone buzzed. It was Victor. I answered immediately. Well, I asked. Victor didn't waste time. Diane, that land isn't just valuable. How valuable? Extremely. I could hear papers shuffling on his desk. The highway expansion project was approved last year. Several commercial developers are already buying nearby properties. And Elaine's land? It sits right in the middle of the development zone. How much are we talking about? There was a pause. At least $3 million, maybe more. Elaine's eyes widened as she listened. $3 million, she whispered. Victor continued. And that's exactly why they're rushing her. Of course they were. If Elaine signed that transfer document, they could sell the land immediately and keep every dollar. Victor, I said quietly. Yes, I'm attending the meeting tomorrow. As Elaine, yes, he sighed softly. You always did prefer interesting solutions. But legally, he added, as long as Elaine hasn't signed anything yet, the land still belongs entirely to her. Perfect. After the call ended, Elaine looked at me in shock. All this time, the land was worth that much? Yes. And they knew, almost certainly. She covered her mouth with her hand. Diane, they've been pushing me for months. That was the final confirmation I needed. But then she looked at me with worry. What if they realize you're not me? I smiled calmly. Elaine, most people only see what they expect to see. But Harold has lived with me for 40 years. Yes, I said. And that's exactly why he won't notice. Because Harold wasn't paying attention to Elaine the person. He was paying attention to Elaine the role. The quiet wife, the agreeable woman, the person who signed whatever he placed in front of her. All I had to do was play that role just long enough for them to reveal their real plan. As the evening sun began to set outside the hotel windows, I stood up. It's time, I said. Time for what? To go home? Elaine looked nervous again. My home, she corrected quietly. I shook my head. Not tonight. Tonight it was mine. And the moment I walked through that front door pretending to be Elaine Foster, I would be living inside a house with 3 people who believed they had already won. What they didn't understand yet was that the woman returning to that house had spent 30 years studying people exactly like them. And by the time Saturday's meeting arrived, they were going to reveal far more than they ever intended. The most dangerous moment in any plan is the moment you step inside it. Not when you think about it, not when you prepare, but when the door closes behind you and there's no turning back. That evening, as I pulled my car into the gravel driveway of my sister Elaine's house, I sat still for a few seconds and looked at the place carefully. Nothing about the house looked unusual. It was a simple ranch-style home surrounded by fields, white siding, a wooden porch, a row of aging maple trees along the fence line. From the outside, it looked like the kind of peaceful home people imagine when they talk about quiet country life. But appearances can be very deceptive. Because inside that house, my sister had spent years slowly losing her voice. And tonight, the people responsible believed she was coming back exactly the same. They had no idea the woman stepping out of that car had spent 30 years studying human behavior in the most difficult situations imaginable. I adjusted the collar of Elaine's coat and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Same face, same hairstyle, same glasses, even the same way she tied her scarf. Before leaving the hotel, we had practiced small details for almost an hour. How she walked, how she answered questions, the rhythm of her voice. Most people underestimate how much behavior reveals identity. But when 2 people have lived together for 67 years, those differences can be minimized. And the most important rule of deception is simple: don't overperform. Act natural, and people rarely question what they expect to see. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. The porch light flicked on just as I reached the front steps, and a familiar voice came from inside. Elaine. That you, Harold, my brother-in-law? I felt my shoulders instinctively relax, just like Elaine described. That small shift in posture, the quiet, slightly hesitant way she carried herself, was part of the role. Yes, I answered softly. The door opened. Harold Foster stood in the doorway wearing his usual expression. Part irritation, part authority. He looked older than the last time I had seen him a few years earlier, but the sharpness in his eyes was still there. For a few seconds he studied my face. My heart rate didn't change. In negotiations, the person who looks nervous first loses control of the conversation. You were gone most of the day, he said, not concern, not curiosity. Just accusation. I went into town, I replied quietly. He stepped aside to let me enter. Dinner's already finished. Of course it was. Elaine had told me about this routine. Meals happened when Harold decided. Everyone else adapted. As I stepped inside the house, I looked around slowly. Everything matched Elaine's description. The living room was neat but slightly outdated. Heavy wooden furniture, family photographs along the wall. One picture caught my attention. Elaine in her 30s, smiling widely beside Harold. She looked confident in that photo. Alive. It's amazing how much a person can change without anyone noticing. Where were you exactly? Harold asked behind me. There it was, control through questioning. Just driving, I said gently. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked past me into the kitchen. Mark was here earlier, he said. Looking over the paperwork? Of course he was. Rachel's upstairs, Harold continued. They'll both be here tomorrow. Tomorrow, the meeting, the trap, I nodded. All right. Harold opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of iced tea. You ready for tomorrow? The question sounded casual, but I knew better. He was testing, looking for hesitation, looking for signs of resistance. I kept my voice steady. Yes. He studied my face again. Good. Then he said something interesting. Because we can't keep delaying this. There it was again. Pressure. Greed always creates urgency. As he walked back toward the living room, I followed slowly, letting my eyes study the house. Every detail mattered. People reveal secrets in the spaces they control. On the coffee table sat several folders. Legal folders, Mark's work, no doubt. I memorized the color of the tabs, the order they were stacked. Small details become important later. Just as I sat down in the armchair Elaine usually used, another voice floated down from upstairs. Elaine, is that you? Rachel. A moment later, she appeared at the top of the staircase. Rachel Foster had the polished appearance of someone who spent a lot of time thinking about how others perceived her. Perfect hair, soft smile, carefully controlled tone, but the eyes always give things away. And Rachel's eyes were calculating. Oh good, she said as she walked down the stairs. You're back. Hello, Rachel. She tilted her head slightly. You look tired. I'm fine. She sat across from me and crossed her legs neatly. We were starting to worry, she said. I almost smiled, not because it was kind, because it was strategic. People like Rachel frame concern as a way to guide behavior. Well, she continued, tomorrow is a big day. Yes. Mark's voice came from outside just then as a car door slammed. Perfect timing. A moment later, Mark Foster walked through the front door. Mark was taller than I expected. Confident, sharp movements. The kind of man who believed momentum meant power. Hey, he said casually. Then he paused. For a moment his eyes narrowed slightly. My heart rate stayed perfectly calm. This was the first real test. But then he shrugged. Good, he said. What's good? Rachel asked. That she's here. Mark tossed his keys on the counter. Tomorrow we finally get this sorted. He walked toward the coffee table and picked up one of the folders. You had a chance to look over the documents yet? I shook my head slightly. Not yet. Don't worry, Mark said quickly. It's all straightforward. Of course it was. Whenever someone says something is simple, it usually isn't. Rachel leaned forward. The developers are offering a very fair deal. Very fair, Mark repeated. Harold added from his chair, and it helps the whole family. 3 voices. Same message. This was coordinated, pressure through repetition. Another classic tactic. But what they didn't know was that I had already spoken to Victor. And I already knew the truth about the land. $3 million at minimum, possibly more. Meanwhile, they were pretending this was just paperwork. Mark placed the folder in front of me. You can review everything tonight if you want. I looked down at the papers but didn't open them, not yet. In negotiations, impatience reveals weakness. Instead, I asked a simple question. Who else will be there tomorrow? Mark looked pleased. A few people from the development company and a local agent. Harold added, just witnesses to finalize the agreement. Witnesses, exactly what I hoped. Because witnesses change everything, I nodded slowly. All right, Mark smiled. See, nothing to worry about. Rachel stood up and patted my shoulder lightly. You should get some rest. Then she added something that revealed far more than she intended. Tomorrow will solve a lot of problems? Yes, it would, but not the way they expected. Later that night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I sat quietly in the living room. The house was silent. I took out my phone and sent a message to Victor. They confirmed the meeting, developers attending. His reply came within minutes. Good, I'll be nearby tomorrow just in case. Perfect. Then another message arrived. From Elaine, are you all right? I typed back. Yes. Then I added one more line. They have no idea. As I placed the phone down and looked around the dark room, I realized something important. Harold, Mark, Rachel. All 3 of them believed tomorrow would be the day they secured the land. The day they convinced Elaine Foster to sign everything away. What they didn't understand yet was that the woman sitting in their living room tonight had spent 30 years watching people destroy themselves with their own greed. And tomorrow, they were about to do exactly that. One thing I learned during 30 years as a crisis negotiator is this: people reveal their real intentions when they believe you're no longer paying attention. And that night, Harold, Mark, and Rachel believed Elaine had gone to sleep. But the woman lying quietly on that living room couch wasn't Elaine. It was me, and I was listening to every word. The house had gone silent around midnight. The television upstairs turned off, the kitchen lights dimmed, and the sound of Harold's heavy footsteps moved toward the bedroom. For a while, nothing happened. Then around 1 in the morning, I heard the floor creak again. Another door opened upstairs, soft voices followed. I stayed perfectly still, then Mark's voice drifted down the hallway. "Did she look at the documents?" Rachel answered first. "I don't think so." "Good," Mark said quietly. I could almost picture them standing in the hallway, whispering like conspirators who believed their plan was nearly complete. Harold's voice joined a moment later. "It doesn't matter if she reads them." His tone carried the kind of confidence that only comes when someone believes the outcome is guaranteed. "She'll sign tomorrow," he continued. "Why are you so sure?" Rachel asked. Harold chuckled softly. "Because she always does." That sentence stayed with me because it explained everything. For years, Elaine had been conditioned to say yes. Yes to Harold, yes to Mark, yes to whatever solution they presented as best for the family. And once a pattern like that forms, people stop expecting resistance. They stop looking for it. Which was exactly why none of them had noticed the difference in my behavior earlier that evening. But Mark still sounded slightly cautious. "What if she hesitates tomorrow?" he asked. "She won't," Harold replied again. "But if she does, we remind her about the evaluation." There it was. The same pressure Elaine had mentioned during our phone call. The threat that she might be declared mentally unfit to manage her own property. Rachel lowered her voice. "You really think that would work?" Harold scoffed. "Of course it would work." Then he said something that made my hands tighten slightly against the couch cushion. "She's been acting confused lately anyway." "Not really," Rachel replied. "She's just nervous." "Well," Harold said calmly, "nervous people make mistakes. Doctors see what they're told to see." There it was again, the quiet manipulation, the casual belief that systems meant to protect people could be used against them. Mark spoke next. "Once she signs the transfer, how fast can we move the land?" I listened carefully, because this was the moment that mattered. Rachel answered this time. "The development company already drafted the next contract." "How much are they offering?" Mark asked. Harold laughed quietly. "Enough." "Come on," Mark insisted. "Tell me." There was a short pause. Then Harold said the number, 3.2 million. Even though I already knew the land was valuable, hearing the exact figure made the situation clearer. $3.2 million. And Elaine had been told it was simply paperwork to simplify taxes. Rachel sounded impressed. "That's more than I expected." Mark's voice was sharper now. "Exactly why we need her signature tomorrow." Then he added something else. "And once the transfer happens, she won't have any control anyway." Rachel hesitated. "What about her living here?" Mark laughed. "You really think Dad wants that forever?" "No," Harold said. "After the sale closes, she'll move somewhere smaller." "Assisted living," Mark suggested. Rachel agreed. "That would look responsible." Responsible. That word almost made me smile, because sometimes the most dangerous plans are the ones disguised as kindness. Mark continued. "And if she resists after the sale?" Harold's answer came without hesitation. "She won't." Then he added calmly, "But if she does, we remind her she signed the documents herself." That was the moment I understood the full strategy. They weren't planning to remove Elaine before the sale. They were planning to trap her legally after the transfer. Once she signed, the land would no longer belong to her. And once the money moved through the family company, she would have no leverage left. I stayed still as their conversation slowly shifted to smaller details. Mark discussing paperwork, Rachel mentioning the guest list for tomorrow's meeting. Apparently, several representatives from the development company would attend. Witnesses. Business partners. People who believed they were watching a routine property transfer, but none of them knew the full story yet. Eventually, the voices moved back upstairs, doors closed. The house went quiet again. I waited another 10 minutes before sitting up, then I reached for my phone. A message from Victor was already waiting. "Everything still on schedule?" I typed back quickly. "Yes." Then I added something important. They confirmed the sale value, 3.2 million. Victor responded almost immediately. Then tomorrow becomes very interesting. Yes, very interesting. I set the phone down and looked around the dim living room. The family photos on the wall suddenly felt different. Because behind those smiling pictures, the reality of this house had been quietly shifting for years. Harold thought tomorrow would be the final step in securing the land. Mark believed the money was already within reach. Rachel believed the story would appear perfectly reasonable to outsiders, but none of them understood the one detail that changed everything. The woman they expected to sit quietly at that table tomorrow wasn't Elaine Foster. It was Diane Callahan. And the most dangerous moment for people who believe they are winning is the moment they stop paying attention. Because tomorrow afternoon, when they slid those papers across the table expecting a simple signature, they were going to discover something they never planned for. Someone had been listening all along. And the story they told themselves about control was about to collapse in front of everyone. Saturday mornings have a strange kind of silence. It's the kind of quiet that makes people believe everything is under control right before the truth walks through the door. I woke up before anyone else in the house. For a moment I stayed still, listening. Years of negotiation work taught me that the first sounds of a house waking up often reveal its emotional temperature. Footsteps, doors closing, voices. But that morning there was nothing yet. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind moving across the fields outside. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Through the window I could see the back property stretching into the distance. 15 acres of land that had once belonged to our mother. 15 acres that Elaine had inherited without realizing how valuable it would become. $3.2 million. That was the number Harold and Mark believed they were about to secure. And they were so confident about it, they had already invited people to witness the moment. Around 8 o'clock, the house began to wake up. Harold came downstairs first. He walked into the kitchen wearing the same serious expression he had the night before. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," I replied softly, keeping Elaine's gentle tone. He opened the cabinet and poured himself coffee. "You ready for today?" "Yes," he nodded. "Good, the developers will be here around noon." There it was again, the confidence. Harold wasn't nervous. He believed everything had already been decided. A few minutes later, Mark came downstairs, followed by Rachel. Mark looked energized, almost excited. Rachel looked polished, like she was preparing for a business presentation rather than a family conversation. "Big day," Mark said as he grabbed a cup of coffee. "Yes," I replied. Rachel smiled politely at me. "We've arranged everything so it will be quick and simple for you." I almost admired the phrasing, quick and simple. That's how people describe decisions they want someone else to make without asking questions. By 11:30, the house started to fill with people. 2 men from the development company arrived first. They introduced themselves as Mr. Dalton and Mr. Reed. Both wore expensive suits and carried leather portfolios. They looked confident, but also cautious. Developers like them deal with land deals all the time, but they also know when situations might become complicated. After them arrived a local real estate agent who was supposed to facilitate the transaction. And finally, just a few minutes before noon, the last guest arrived. Victor Lang, my old friend and retired property attorney. Victor walked through the door calmly, carrying a small briefcase. Harold greeted him with polite confusion. "Victor Lang," Harold said, "I didn't realize you were involved." Victor smiled politely. "Elaine asked me to review the documents." Harold looked at me. For a moment I thought he might question it, but then he simply nodded. "Of course," agreed again. He didn't want to delay the deal by arguing about details. Everyone gathered around the large dining table. Documents were spread neatly across the surface. Mark took the lead immediately. "As everyone knows," he began confidently, "this is simply a property transfer so we can streamline the sale of the back land to the development company." He slid a document toward me. "All we need is Elaine's signature." The room became very quiet. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. Mark handed me a pen. "This transfers the land to the family company so we can finalize the agreement." I picked up the pen slowly. Not because I intended to sign, but because hesitation reveals information. Victor leaned back in his chair, watching carefully. The developers were studying the documents. Rachel folded her hands neatly. Harold looked impatient. And Mark looked confident. "Go ahead," Mark said. "Everything is already arranged." I looked down at the papers, then I asked a simple question. "How much are you selling the land for?" The question caught Mark slightly off guard. He recovered quickly. "The developers have made a very fair offer." "I asked for the number," I said quietly. Mark hesitated, then he answered, 3.2 million. The developers shifted slightly in their chairs. Harold frowned. "That detail wasn't necessary right now," he said. "But it's important to me," I replied. Rachel leaned forward gently. "Elaine, we've discussed this already. This arrangement benefits everyone." "Yes," Harold added. "There's no need to complicate things." I placed the pen down on the table. "I agree." They all relaxed slightly. "Complication is unnecessary," Mark smiled. "Exactly." Then I looked directly at the developers. "And since we're avoiding complications, I think everyone here deserves complete transparency." The room went silent again. "What do you mean?" Mark asked. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "For example, everyone here should probably know that this land legally belongs to Elaine Foster alone." Victor nodded quietly. "And that any transfer would require full disclosure of its market value." Mr. Dalton, one of the developers, spoke up carefully. "That's correct." Mark's expression tightened. "Of course that's correct." I continued calmly. "And they should also know that Elaine Foster has not yet agreed to sell anything." Harold leaned forward. "Elaine, what are you doing?" I looked directly at him. "Something that should have happened a long time ago." Then I stood up slowly. And that was the moment everything changed. Because when I stood up, I didn't carry Elaine's hesitant posture anymore. I stood the way I had stood in negotiation rooms for 30 years. Confident, calm, unmovable. Mark stared at me. "What is this supposed to mean?" I smiled slightly. "It means you've been speaking to the wrong sister." The room froze. Rachel blinked in confusion. Harold's face went pale. Victor leaned back calmly, and Mark slowly said one sentence. "What?" I looked around the table at every person watching. "My name is Diane Callahan," I said. "I'm Elaine's twin sister." Silence. Absolute silence. Mark stood up suddenly. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Victor asked calmly. The developers looked between us. Harold stared at my face, finally noticing what he had missed before. The posture, the voice, the confidence. And then the front door opened. Everyone turned toward the sound, and standing in the doorway was Elaine. Healthy, confident, and no longer afraid. Mark's face drained of color. Rachel's mouth fell open. Harold whispered one word. "Impossible," but it wasn't impossible. It was simply the moment they realized the person they thought they controlled had never actually been alone. And the people who believed they were about to take $3 million from a quiet woman were about to discover something much more expensive. The truth. When my twin sister Elaine walked through that front door, time seemed to stop inside that room. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Not Harold, not Mark, not Rachel. Even the two developers sitting at the table looked confused, their eyes moving slowly between me and the woman standing in the doorway. Because suddenly there were two identical faces in the same room. Two women with the same silver hair, the same eyes, the same height, but there was one very important difference. The woman who had walked in through that door was no longer afraid. Elaine stepped inside slowly. Her shoulders were straight, and for the first time in years, she looked like the confident woman I remembered from our younger days. Harold was the first person to find his voice. "What is this?" he demanded. His tone wasn't confused anymore. It was angry, the kind of anger that appears when someone realizes they are losing control. Mark stood up from his chair. "This is some kind of trick," he said. Rachel looked stunned. "This isn't funny," she added. I folded my hands calmly on the table. "No," I said, "it isn't." The two developers looked at each other uncomfortably. They had expected a routine property meeting. Instead, they were now watching a family confrontation unfold in front of them. Harold pointed toward Elaine. "You told me you were in town all morning," he said. Elaine looked at him quietly. "Yes," she said, "I was." "But you—" Then Harold stopped talking. Because he finally noticed something he hadn't seen before. Elaine wasn't shaking. She wasn't avoiding eye contact. She wasn't shrinking back from his voice. For the first time in years, she was standing her ground. Mark looked between us again. All right, he said slowly. What exactly is going on? Victor Lang leaned forward calmly. As Diane already explained, he said, Elaine asked me to review the documents you prepared. Mark looked irritated. That's not the problem. He pointed toward me. The problem is she just said she isn't Elaine. That's correct, I replied. My name is Diane Callahan. Rachel's voice was tight. You expect us to believe you two switched places? I smiled slightly. You didn't question it for the last 24 hours. That statement made Mark visibly uncomfortable because he realized something important. He hadn't noticed the difference, and neither had Harold. For people who believed they controlled Elaine completely, that realization was humiliating. Harold slammed his hand against the table. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You're trying to delay this agreement? Victor calmly opened his briefcase. Actually, he said, we're clarifying the situation. The developers watched carefully now. They had stopped looking at Mark. They were watching Victor. That's because experienced investors understand one thing very well. When lawyers start speaking calmly, something serious is happening. Victor placed several documents on the table. These are the original property records, he said. They confirm that the land in question belongs entirely to Elaine Foster. Mark crossed his arms. We already know that. Yes, Victor said, but what you failed to disclose was the actual value of that land. The room went quiet again. Mr. Dalton, one of the developers, leaned forward. What value are you referring to? Victor looked directly at him. The land sits inside the new highway development zone. Mr. Dalton nodded slowly. Yes, and based on current offers, Victor continued, its estimated value exceeds $3 million. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. The developers exchanged another glance. But the most interesting reaction came from Elaine. She turned slowly toward Mark. You told me it was just farmland, she said. Mark shifted his weight. Well, technically it is farmland. But now the room had changed because the developers realized something important. They had been invited to witness a property transfer, but the owner of that property had never been told its true value. Mr. Reed cleared his throat. That information should have been explained before any agreement was signed. Mark looked irritated. We were getting to that? Victor shook his head slightly. No, he said, you weren't. Harold suddenly stood up. This conversation is over, he said sharply. Elaine, you agreed to transfer the property. For a moment the room waited for Elaine to respond. This was the moment everyone expected the same pattern to repeat. Harold demanded. Elaine agreed. That's how it had worked for years, but this time something was different. Elaine looked at him calmly. No, she said. Harold blinked. What? I never agreed to sell my land. The words were quiet, but they carried more strength than anything she had said in years. Mark stepped forward quickly. You're misunderstanding the situation. No, Elaine said. For the first time, I understand it perfectly. Rachel tried to recover the conversation. Elaine, we're just trying to help the family. Elaine looked at her for a long moment. Helping the family would have meant telling me the truth. Silence filled the room again. Harold's voice dropped lower. You're making a mistake. Elaine shook her head gently. No. Then she said something that changed everything. I'm keeping the land. Mark's face turned red. You can't just back out now. Why not? Victor asked calmly. Mark pointed toward the developers. They've already prepared contracts. Mr. Dalton stood up slowly. Mr. Foster, he said, no contract exists without the owner's consent. And with that sentence, Mark's plan collapsed. Rachel sank slowly back into her chair. Harold looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. Because control only works when the other person believes they have no choice. And for the first time in years, Elaine had realized she did. Elaine looked at me for a moment. Then she turned back toward the table. I won't be signing anything today. The developers began gathering their papers. Mr. Reed nodded politely. If you ever decide to discuss a future sale, he said to Elaine, we would be happy to speak with you directly. Not Mark. Not Harold, directly, and just like that, the meeting was over. The developers walked toward the door. Victor closed his briefcase. Rachel stared at the table silently. Mark looked furious. But the most important thing in that room was the expression on Elaine's face. For the first time since I had arrived, she looked free. And the people who believed they controlled her future were finally realizing something. They never actually had control at all. When the developers left the house that afternoon, the door closed with a soft click. But the sound echoed through the room like the end of something much larger. For years, that house had been filled with Harold's voice. His rules, his decisions, his quiet ways of reminding Elaine that everything depended on him. But suddenly, the room felt different. The silence no longer belonged to Harold. It belonged to Elaine. Mark was the first to break it. "You just threw away $3 million, he said sharply. His voice was shaking now, not with authority, but with anger. Elaine didn't move. She stood beside the table, her hands resting gently on the back of the chair. "No," she said calmly. "I stopped you from taking something that never belonged to you." Mark laughed bitterly. "You think you're going to handle that land yourself?" "Yes," she said. Rachel tried to step in again, her voice smooth and controlled. "Elaine, we're family. We were only trying to make things easier for everyone." I watched Elaine carefully. For years, Rachel's tone had worked on her. That calm, almost sympathetic voice that made manipulation sound like kindness. But this time, Elaine didn't bend. "You knew what the land was worth," she said. Rachel didn't answer. "You knew, and you never told me." Harold finally stood up from his chair. His face looked pale, and the anger in his voice had been replaced with something else. "Fear, you're making a mistake," he said. Elaine turned toward him slowly. "For years you told me I couldn't manage things myself. I was protecting you." "No," she said quietly. "You were controlling me." The room fell silent again. Harold had no response to that. Because sometimes the truth arrives in a single sentence and there's no way to argue with it. Mark pushed his chair back suddenly. "So what now?" he demanded. "You expect us to just forget about the deal?" Elaine shook her head. "No, then what?" "Now," she said calmly, "we start being honest." Victor Lang spoke gently. "Elaine has several options moving forward." Mark looked annoyed. "Oh, really?" "Yes," Victor replied. "The first option is keeping the property exactly as it is." The second option was something Victor had mentioned earlier that morning, leasing part of the land to the development company instead of selling it, which meant Elaine could earn income from the property while still keeping ownership. When Victor explained that idea, Mark's expression darkened even more. "You didn't mention that before," he said. Victor smiled slightly. "That's because no one asked Elaine what she wanted. And that was the most important point in the entire conversation. For years, decisions in that house had been made without her, but that pattern had finally ended." After a few minutes, Mark grabbed his jacket angrily. "This is pointless," he muttered. Rachel stood slowly as well. "Maybe we should all take some time to think about things." They walked toward the door together. Mark paused before leaving and looked back at Elaine. "You're going to regret this," he said. Elaine met his eyes calmly. "No," she replied. "I'm finally starting to respect myself." And with that, Mark and Rachel left the house. The door closed again. This time the silence felt peaceful. Harold stood in the middle of the room for a moment. He looked older than he had that morning. Years older. Finally, he spoke quietly. "You planned all of this," he said, looking at me. I shrugged slightly. "No," I replied. "Elaine planned it." He looked at her. For a long moment he didn't say anything, then he slowly walked toward the hallway. "I need some air," he muttered. A few seconds later the back door opened and closed. Victor leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said, "that went better than expected." Elaine let out a small laugh. The sound surprised even her. "I can't believe I actually said those things." "You've been wanting to say them for years," I told her. She nodded slowly. "Yes." Then she looked at me. "Thank you." I shook my head. "You did the important part?" "What part?" "Standing up. Because that's the hardest step for anyone who has spent years being told they are powerless. Standing up once changes everything." Later that evening, Victor finished reviewing the documents and left. The house was quiet again, but the quiet felt completely different now. Elaine and I sat together on the back porch watching the sun set over the fields. For the first time since I arrived, she looked relaxed. "Do you remember when we were kids?" she asked. "Always," I said. She smiled. "We used to sit outside Mom's house just like this." "Except we argued more," I laughed. "That's true." We sat quietly for a few minutes. Then Elaine said something thoughtful. "I spent so many years thinking I had no choices. That happens to a lot of people, I replied. But the truth is, choices are always there. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us. A few weeks later, things had changed dramatically. Harold moved into a small apartment in town. Mark and Rachel stopped visiting the house completely, and Elaine began working with Victor to create a long-term plan for the land. Instead of selling everything immediately, she decided to lease part of the property to the developers. The agreement guaranteed her steady income while still keeping the land in her name. But the biggest change had nothing to do with money, it had to do with confidence. Elaine started making decisions again, her own decisions. She repaired the old barn on the property. She planted a small vegetable garden behind the house. And she started inviting neighbors over for coffee again. One afternoon a few months later, I stopped by to visit. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something new, a small wooden sign near the road. Elaine had carved it herself. It read, Foster Family Land Est, 1983. When she saw me looking at it, she smiled proudly. I figured it was time to remind people who owns this place. I laughed. That's a very good idea. She looked out across the fields again. You know, she said, for years I thought strength meant arguing or fighting. And now I think strength means knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone take it. That sentence stayed with me. Because it's a lesson every woman deserves to hear. Sometimes people will try to convince you that you are too small, too confused, or too weak to protect what belongs to you. But the moment you stop believing that story, everything changes. And in Elaine's case, all it took was one quiet decision: to stop saying yes and finally say no.